So, when you hear the name Israel Putnam, what comes to mind? You probably picture this larger-than-life hero of the American Revolution. The guy who famously rode his horse down a cliff to escape the British. He's celebrated in statues and towns all across America. But the real story of Old Put, as they called him, is so much more complicated and, frankly, way more interesting than the myths. So let's try to separate the man from the legend. So who was the real Israel Putnam? Was he this fearless folk hero, Washington's go-to guy, famous for these unbelievable escapes? Or was he a seriously flawed general, accused of cowardice, a guy who lost major battles, and an enslaver fighting in a war for liberty? The real answer? Well, as we're about to see, it's somewhere in the messy middle. All right, first up, let's talk about the powerful image that has defined Putnam for centuries, America's very first folk hero. This is the Old Put of legend, the guy who was the living embodiment of almost reckless courage. And I mean, nothing captures this image better than his most famous stunt. Just try to picture this. It is the dead of winter, British dragoons are right on his heels, and this 60-year-old general does the one thing nobody would ever expect. Okay, so let's break this down. It's February 1779, and Putnam is totally cornered in Greenwich, Connecticut. He can either surrender or do something absolutely insane. He chooses insane. He yanks the reins and steers his horse straight down 100 stone steps, all covered in snow and ice. The British soldiers at the top just stopped. They were completely stunned. This single act of defiance is really what cemented his status as this larger-than-life American hero. And you know what? This reputation for being a daredevil, it wasn't new. This quote, "He dared to lead where any dared to follow," actually comes from his time in the French and Indian War, decades earlier. It just goes to show you, his personal bravery was legendary long before the revolution even started. He was always that guy at the very front. So yeah, Putnam fits the bill for a folk hero perfectly. His life was just jam-packed with these wild tales of adventure and courage, from fighting wolves in their own dens to escaping certain death over and over. But this is where the simple, heroic story starts to fall apart, and the complicated history really begins. See, for all his personal bravery, his reputation as a general, well, that was a whole other story. It was fiercely debated. And that debate kicks off with his most famous battle, Bunker Hill. Of course, his supporters, people like his own son Daniel, defended him to the hilt. To them, he was exactly what the legends claimed, a man who was always in the thick of the action, a man whose courage was totally beyond question. But then, you get this, a completely blistering accusation from Captain Henry Dearborn, who was also there at Bunker Hill. He said Putnam's performance was so bad he should have been executed for it. Whoa. So how can both of these things possibly be true? So here's the breakdown of the argument. On one side, you have Dearborn accusing Putnam of everything from failing to send in reinforcements, to just hanging back in the rear, to basically being a coward. But on the other side, Putnam's defenders fired back with a totally different story. They said he was actively rallying troops, that Dearborn's accusations were just political mudslinging decades later, and hey, other veterans backed up Putnam's version, and even George Washington praised him. And this wasn't just some brief spat. Right after the battle in 1775, things were chaotic, and nobody was really sure who did what. But fast forward 43 years to 1818, and Dearborn's account just blows the whole thing wide open. It ignited what historians call a memory war that literally raged for decades, a fierce battle over one man's legacy. And look, the questions about his leadership, they didn't end at Bunker Hill, not by a long shot. As the war went on, a pretty troubling pattern started to emerge. At the disastrous Battle of Long Island, his critics said he completely failed to guard key mountain passes, which led to a massive American defeat. Then, a year later, he lost the critical forts that were supposed to be protecting the Hudson River. This loss was so bad that Washington himself ordered an inquiry, basically a court-martial. Now, Putnam was eventually cleared, but the damage to his reputation as a strategist was done. And this number? Well, this number says everything. After that whole disaster in the Hudson Highlands, how many more independent commands did George Washington give Israel Putnam? The answer is a big, fat 0. He was put into roles where Washington could keep a direct eye on him. The commander-in-chief had clearly lost faith in him. So we've got this split, right? Brave warrior, but maybe a not-so-great general. But modern history, it adds another layer to the story. And this one is even tougher to deal with. And it brings us right to a question that we're all still wrestling with today. Not just about Putnam, but about so many figures from our past. It forces us to look beyond the battlefield and confront a really fundamental contradiction. The first one is this. Like so many of his peers, Israel Putnam was an enslaver. And critics today make a powerful point. If you tell his hero story, but leave that part out, you're not telling the whole truth. But it gets even more complex. Some people back then thought he was way too soft on loyalists. And then there's this really startling letter from 1783, where he wrote that he had come to believe that separating from Britain was an erroneous opinion. A mistake. Can you believe that? Okay, so after all of that, how on earth do we make sense of this guy? What's the final verdict on General Israel Putnam?
This really gets to the heart of it. On one side of the ledger, you've got this man with just immense personal courage, an inspiring warrior who was great at leading small groups of soldiers. But on the other side of that same ledger, you have a pretty limited strategic general, a guy who was prone to making impulsive decisions and who just wasn't effective when you gave him a large-scale command. He was both of these things at the very same time.
And yet, despite all the controversy, all the failures, just look at how he's remembered. 9 states have places named after him. There are statues celebrating his daring escape. His actual gravestone is preserved in the Connecticut State Capitol building. The folk hero's story has proven to be incredibly powerful.
I mean, it's the perfect summary, isn't it? His legend, it's literally set in stone, celebrated in bronze and granite. But his real history? Well, that's far more nuanced, full of contradictions, and written in all sorts of shades of gray.
And in the end, Putnam's story isn't just about some general from the 1700s. It's really about us. It forces us to ask a really tough question for our own time. How do we remember our heroes when we discover that they were also deeply and sometimes uncomfortably flawed?